Today is December 22nd. 3i Atlas is making its closest approach to Earth, and we have too little time left to explain the strangeness in familiar terms. The most terrifying thing happened not in the sky, but in the data. At the same hour, different telescopes in different countries saw the same anomaly, as if the object had pressed a single button for everyone. If this were a glitch, it would have looked different. The image would have been blurry in some places. The spectrum would have been obscured by noise in others. The calibration would have been off in others. Here, everything matched perfectly. The first thing to respond was the ground-based astrometry stations. Not a picture of a beautiful comet, but the exact coordinates of a point that suddenly shifted so precisely, as if someone had adjusted the trajectory with a ruler. Then came footage from large optical systems. The jet didn't disintegrate or breathe chaotically. It maintained its shape and angle, too stable for a dirty snowball, which should function according to thermodynamics. Then they connected to space. Hubble doesn't know the weather, doesn't know the dome, doesn't know the vibrations of the platform. And it confirmed the same thing. The tail structure became assembled, as if it had engaged containment mode. And then came a signal from the radio and millimeter wave bands. These are usually plagued by complex noise, and yet within 1 hour, the spectrum shifted equally on 2 independent receivers. This eliminates the beloved excuse, your instrument is acting up. Instruments don't act up in sync across oceans, and they certainly don't act up in such a way as to produce the same emission patterns. At the same hour, the anti-tail became straighter and denser. It didn't appear this way because of the viewing angle, but rather literally behaved like a physical jet, maintaining its direction contrary to the solar wind. The worst feeling was felt by those responsible for the dynamics. They saw a micro-correction so small that it could hardly be called a maneuver, and so precise that it could not be called an accident. A comet has no reason to choose a beautiful moment. Ice has no concept of synchronization. But here, it looked as if the object knew when it was being watched and chose the moment of maximum attention. When this thought was first voiced, the room fell silent. Not because everyone believed it, but because everyone understood the cost of a mistake. This phrase cannot be simply dismissed. NASA called an emergency meeting almost immediately. Not a press center or public questions, but a short, closed-door conversation between people who wouldn't confuse noise with fact. No one says aliens on these calls. They talk about data compatibility, systemic reasons, eliminating local factors, and repeatability across independent channels. And yet, the meaning was simple. If different instruments see the same thing at the same hour, then we're not dealing with a measurement error, but with the object's behavior. Meanwhile, the public line was already preparing a calm statement. Nothing unusual, standard cometary activity is being observed, no threats. The words were as smooth as a lid on a simmering pot. The problem was that they were already seeing something different inside. They were seeing order where there should have been chaos. They were seeing stability where there should have been inertia. They were seeing synchronicity where there should have been chaos. Someone suggested a test that sounds boring but hits the mark. Completely change the observation schedule, remove coordination, hide the windows, and create a blind schedule. The logic is simple. If it's an artifact, it will disappear or become meaningless. If it's a reaction, it will adapt to the new mode, because the object keeps in mind not our calendar, but the very fact of observation. A short time later, new packets arrived. The anomaly hadn't disappeared. It had reconfigured itself. Not like a device breaking down, but like a system reconfiguring itself, continuing its task. It was then that one of the engineers said something that sent a chill down your spine. He's not tied to our schedule. He's tied to our attempt to synchronize. After that, requests flew to the most serious instruments, large ground-based telescopes, spectrographs, tracking networks. Those who usually don't change the order of observations without causing a war in the sky. Every answer began the same way. We can give a window, but it's short. And it sounded almost mocking, because the subject was also giving a window. They just chose when. On the combined diagram, everything looked frighteningly beautiful. The optics showed a collected tail, The radio spectrum showed a spectrum shift, and the dynamics calculation showed a microscopic change in course. 3 different languages, 1 meaning. At one point, Atlas began acting as if it had switched to a mode. It didn't amplify, it didn't flare up, it just switched. And if this switch coincided worldwide, then it wasn't a random flash, but something like a command. A command we didn't send, but which we all saw. The question was no longer, is it dangerous? The question became, what exactly is he measuring when he brings our planet into the focus of all the telescopes at once? Because the scariest thing about this day isn't intimacy. The scariest thing is the feeling that we've suddenly become the object of observation, and this observation is synchronized better than we can manage ourselves. There was no panic within the meeting. There was something else, something far worse. The kind of overly quick discipline that only emerges when people are truly afraid of making a mistake. The first thing we did was throw out the fancy words and stick to the bare criteria. The anomaly must be visible simultaneously in different data types: position, brightness, spectrum, tail morphology, and most importantly, the timestamp must match. Everything came together, and it didn't look like a random burst of activity as comets sometimes do. It felt like a synchronous switch, as if the object had briefly entered a mode of operation and then just as neatly exited. Some tried to resort to the usual: the influence of the sun, a surge in wind, a localized impact on the coma. But the solar wind doesn't choose Earth as its stage. It hits across the entire front, and then the changes spread out rather than converge in a single hour. Then a topic often avoided came up in conversation: controlled orientation, not in the sense of mind, but in the sense of there's a mechanism that maintains the vector. They brought up the old piece again, the one no one liked: the axis and jets, which remain locked to the sun with excessive precision. It was unpleasant even to discuss, because a normal comet doesn't behave like that. At that very moment, Hubble was asked to provide the priority image. Not for the image itself, but for the structural data: width, boundaries, symmetry, and how stable the aperture angle was. At the same time, they began shaking up the ground tracking networks. Those who have been doing the boring but crucial job for years. Precise position measurements. So they can see micro corrections not just by eye, but in coordinates. And then a detail appeared that suddenly took the breath away from people accustomed to space. The shift wasn't chaotic. It was directed, soft, and very clean, as if the object had slightly adjusted its course to maintain the desired geometry. It's too small to call it motor, if you want to calm down, and too structural to call it noise, if you're being honest. Because noise looks like this: plus and minus back and forth, with residuals in different directions. But here the residuals were all in one direction, as if they were forced into a frame. Then they turned on another filter: a check on the atmosphere and local conditions. If it's a terrestrial problem, it will manifest itself in various ways: humidity, turbulence, transparency. It didn't manifest itself, and this particularly infuriated those who were hoping for a simple explanation. The world is too convenient when the weather is to blame. By this point, it had already become clear that the object wasn't simply passing by. It was doing so in a way that was meant to be observable. Not in a bright, spectacular way, but in a measurable way. This is an important distinction. Spectacle is needed by humans. Measurability is needed by those who collect the parameters. And then, at the center of the conversation, a question emerged that is usually not asked out loud because it sounds too direct. What is he trying to take from us at this hour? If we look at this from a purely physical perspective, there's a logical set of objectives: the density of the atmosphere at the edge, the radio noise of our civilization, the magnetosphere, reflections in various bands, even the thermal profile of the night side. But the way it was done made one think not of a natural comet, but of probing. Because probing always prefers synchronicity. You initiate the mode, maintain stability, and obtain a clean array of data. And then the worst part begins. Probing isn't done at random. It's done when you know in advance you'll see something interesting. The word windows came up in conversation. Observation windows, transmission windows, geometry windows. And someone noted that this window coincides not only between telescopes, but also between communication lines. It was as if at that hour, the object became convenient for everyone. And this couldn't be explained by terrestrial coordination, because terrestrial coordination had just been disrupted. They tried another experiment. They introduced artificial chaos, changing frequencies, staggering exposure times, hiding reference stars, and complicating the calibration task. If the object is simply gushing, it doesn't care. If it adapts, you'll see adaptation. The adaptation wasn't manifested in the fact that it responded, as in the movie, but in the fact that the tail's structure remained legible as we changed modes. It wasn't perfect, but it seemed designed for us to try. And then someone said something that would later be whispered, "He's not showing off, he's testing how much we can measure." It sounded crazy until we remembered something simple. The entire history of human science is measurement. If you want to understand the level of a civilization, you look not at its cities, but at how it measures the world. And if that's true, then that hour wasn't an anomaly. It was a test. Small, brief, careful, but profound. After that, the public line was clamped down even more tightly. Any leak could turn the strange data into hysteria. So only mild statements came out. We're monitoring, clarifying, standard procedures. But internally, a different regime has emerged. Restricted access protocols, separate channels, lists of those who can see raw data, and urgent requests for even more powerful tools. Because if the object is truly controllable, it should exhibit signs of constructiveness, repeatable angles, nozzle symmetry, atypical spectral lines, and the behavior of dust in the coma. And if this happens simultaneously within the same hour, then he can repeat it. Or he already is, we just haven't put the picture together yet. The most disturbing conclusion to this section was simple. We stopped saying what it is. We started saying what it does. And when the conversation shifts to does, it's no longer about a comet. It's about an active object. While on the outside it looked like a normal night of astronomy, on the inside it already resembled an investigation. Not just about catching a beautiful shot, but about collecting evidence so that no one could later blame it on noise, error, or human imagination. The first thing they did was break that hour down into segments. Not, it was weird at 1 hour, but what minute did it start, what minute did it peak, what minute did it die down? Because a natural outburst usually doesn't have a neat profile. It's jagged, it's messy, it lives as it pleases. And here the profile resembled a mode switch. Entry, plateau, exit. This is how systems that conserve resources and don't want to glow longer than necessary work. The next layer was even more disconcerting. They correlated this profile not with the weather or the sun, but with the observation geometry. The Earth to object vector, the sun to object vector, the magnetosphere orientation, even the position of the moon as a source of stray light. And they found a coincidence that fit the probing pattern all too well. The peak of the mode occurred when the object simultaneously had the clearest angle to Earth and maintained the correct orientation to the sun. It's not like a comet just floating. It's like a device that needs power and a view. Someone in the chat wrote briefly, without emotion, energy plus line of sight. No one argued. Then a debate arose about what exactly the telescopes were recording. Because everyone sees the same thing sounds nice, but what's important is what exactly the same thing is. One instrument saw a change in the coma's shape, another saw a strengthening of the narrow tail component, and a third saw a spectral shift in individual lines. And all of this coincided in time, as if different sensors were observing different parts of the same operation. If you want to protect yourself from self-deception, you look not for one confirmation, but 3 independent ones. And here they were. Then the most dangerous question arose. If this is an operation, what is its purpose? There were only 2 options, and both were unpleasant. Either it was self-calibration on our system, testing its controls and stability, or it was us calibration, an attempt to understand what we see, what we hear, and how we react. At this point, a fact emerged that's usually disliked in such stories because it shatters the peace. Our main surveillance systems don't just watch. They communicate with each other, coordinate windows, plan schedules, and make public announcements. That is, we ourselves leave traces of coordination. We make ourselves legible. And if the object is intelligent enough, even at the level of automation, it doesn't need to eavesdrop on secret channels. It's enough to see patterns. When telescopes around the world suddenly rotate synchronously, it's visible from schedules, telemetry, and indirect data. And then, within the conversation, a nasty thought entered. Perhaps he chose this hour not because it happened, but because he saw that we were ready, that our windows were open, that we were focused. Not a response to a request, but a use of our readiness. Next, they employed a tactic beloved by engineers and loathed by PR professionals: provocation. Take a step that the target might notice, but which is harmless. For example, abruptly change the frequency and transmission mode in certain radio bands where the Earth's noise is loudest. Or conversely, briefly jam some of the public noise to see if its behavior changes. The idea is simple. If it's a natural comet, it doesn't care. If it's a system, it can react at least statistically, not intelligently, but simply as an adaptive algorithm. And then something happened that no one wanted to record as a conclusion, but everyone saw with their own eyes. After the first mode change, the brightness of the object's narrow tail component changed. Not much, not enough to scream contact, but enough for those working with the raw data to notice. Too neat and too fast. No one said, "He heard." They said something else. Correlation with an external factor. This is what science sounds like when it tries not to get carried away by emotions. And then, almost automatically, a second thought occurred to me. If the correlation is real, then the object is sensitive to our noise. It either registers it, uses it as background noise, or studies it as a signature of civilization. And then comes the moment that usually breaks any attempt to calm the viewer. Because if the subject is studying the signature of a civilization, the next logical step is to study the reaction. Not just electromagnetic. Organizational. How quickly we gather. How quickly we conceal. How quickly we make public statements. How quickly we change our behavior. And now it was already visible. Internal chains of command around the world had converged in a matter of minutes, while publicly, everything continued to be business as usual. People don't gather at such a speed out of curiosity. They gather at such a speed because they're afraid of missing a window. At one point, one of the participants said something that irritates everyone, but often turns out to be true. We're behaving predictably these days. He explained it simply. If an object performs a test, the test is designed so that we cannot fail it. We inevitably react. We inevitably try to measure. We inevitably change modes. That is, even our caution becomes a signal. After that, the call entered a more serious phase. Not a discussion, but a task-setting session. We need further confirmation of the synchronicity using other instruments. We need a repeat at a different point in the trajectory. We need polarization data to understand the structure of the dust in the field. We need high dynamic range images to see the fine edges of the jets. And we needed one thing, which sounded strange but was logical. We needed silence. A short period where we deliberately avoided any active actions, to see if he'd repeat the routine without our prompting. If he repeats it, it means he's following his own program. If not, it means he's reacting to us. And this became the main bet of the next night. Because the first hour was too pure to be a fluke. And the second could have been proof that this wasn't just physics, but a script someone had already written. On paper, it was called a passive window. Inside the call, it was called something simpler: silence. One short interval where we do nothing first and wait to see who starts. The problem was that silence is almost impossible in modern astronomy. Even if you're silent, you still leave a mark. schedules, logistics, shifts, open requests for telescope time. So they decided to be more cunning. Not do nothing, but pretend everything was going as usual, but without synchronization. Scatter the observations across random windows, like noise, without any overall picture. And then fear arose. If the subject truly responded to patterns, they would notice that too. A change in behavior was also a signal. But they had no other way to separate their program from our reaction. Someone suggested an extreme. Remove the major instruments entirely and leave only amateurs. Let him see the silence of the serious and only the faint background of private observations. The idea sounded almost offensive, but it worked logically. If the mode only activates when large systems are watching, then it recognizes our attention level rather than just flashing a light. On the second day, they sent out short instructions through channels that weren't usually broadcast to the outside world. Not an order, not panic, but a dry protocol. Close window A, move window B, leave window C. At the same time, the PR team was preparing the most secure possible text. Routine observations, no threats. Subject is behaving as expected. Not a word about synchronicity, not a word about that hour. And this division became the most alarming. Inside, in technical chats, people were already talking about a system. Outside, they were selling the public a sense of calm, as if it were a weather forecast. On a night of silence, everyone sat at the data center as if they were waiting not for a comet's flash, but for an answer. The screen refreshed more often than conscience allowed, and no one even left for coffee. The first stretch passed calmly. No beauty, no anomalous narrow stream, no perfect profile. And for a second, someone exhaled, because the brain always wants a simple explanation. Then the object did something that dashed that hope. It activated the same mode, but later and more briefly, as if checking to see if we were watching it even in silence. It was worse than a one-to-one repetition, because a one-to-one repetition can be called a cycle. But a repetition with a time adjustment already smacks of adaptation. This time, confirmation came not from a single instrument, but from 3 sources at once. One saw a thickening in the coma, another a sharp stabilization of the narrow component of the tail, and a third a jump in individual spectral lines. And again, everything settled down at the same hour, but the hour was different. It was as if the subject had deliberately avoided the previous peak to allay suspicion, but hadn't abandoned the procedure itself. What happened next was what usually happens when people try to hide a major anomaly. Someone requested access too quickly. Someone lifted a restriction too abruptly. Someone, on the contrary, locked the data for review. These are small things, but small things leave traces. A strange gap appeared in one of the work feeds. The graph updated, then disappeared for a few minutes, then returned smoothed out. Smoothing isn't a crime, it's standard processing. But on a night like this, any smooth sounds like hidden. And that's where trust within the team breaks down. One of the techies wrote a phrase that brought silence to the room. If he's testing us, the next test won't be on the light. The next test will be on the system's reaction. And at that moment, a notification arrived that another major tool was being brought into the work, the kind usually used when a crucial shot is needed. Not because it's pretty, but because otherwise you might not understand anything at all. And here, a fork in the road arose that left them breathless. If we connect it now, we'll show the subject it's on target. If we don't connect it, we'll lose the chance to see what it's actually doing. The decision was made quickly, too quickly for calm science. Connect. But do it in a way that would appear outwardly to be a routine part of the program, without any sudden moves, without any public signs of alarm. They thought they had the picture under control, but they forgot one thing. If the target truly reads our coordination, they won't see a press release or a tweet. They'll see that we've already chosen a side. The connection went quietly, almost beautifully. No big announcements, no emergency, just another slot in the schedule, another line in the log. But deep down, everyone understood. This isn't a line, it's a gesture. When you focus your most precise eye on an object, You tell it one thing: you matter. The data arrived with a delay, as always happens with large systems. The minutes dragged on strangely. No one spoke, lest they lose their breath. The first frame that arrived explained nothing and complicated everything. The object looked too smooth. Not perfect, but precisely smooth, as if it knew how to be still. A typical comet always has some messy behavior. Localized outbursts, clumsy tails, jagged edges. Here, the edges were neater than I'd like. Someone said that this happens with the right geometry and angles. And it sounded reasonable until the next episode arrived. In the second episode, it wasn't the tail or the coma that changed. It was the way the object reflected light. Too quickly, too selectively, as if he were twirling the surface like a control knob. Light shouldn't act like a button. It should act like a material. Stone and ice don't switch like a screen. It was at this point that someone in the chat, where they usually write dry numbers, threw in a simple phrase: "He sees us." No one answered right away, because it's a phrase that can't be answered with yes or no without being frightened by your own voice. At the same time, data arrived from the radio spectrum. Not a signal like in the movies, not a voice, not a code. Simply a narrow band that appeared only during those moments when several systems were simultaneously observing the object. The problem isn't that there's a streak. Streaks happen. The problem is that it coincided with their unification. It was that trick again, only more subtle. Before, it was as if the object had turned on a flashlight. Now it turned on a small indicator, as if checking whether you were together or apart. One of the engineers compared it to a peephole. You don't open the door, you just see who's there. Quickly, discreetly, without leaving a trace. And then the worst happened. The indicator responded to their attempt to hide their coordination. It appeared at the precise moment their charts coincided by chance. Accidentally, meaning according to a plan without a plan. They deliberately scattered the windows, but the enormous instruments still sometimes align, like waves. And the object captured exactly that. Not the entire hour, but a subtle peak of togetherness. As if it didn't need your calendar. It needed the fact that you were in sync, even if only for a moment. After this, NASA held a second meeting, shorter and more intense. They weren't arguing about words anymore. They were arguing about behavior. 2 lines split the room. One said, "Continue and record everything." The other said, "We feed him our attention." And that was the trap. If you stop observing, you lose data. If you observe, you strengthen the test. Someone suggested a compromise. Maintain surveillance, but blind the target. No lasers, no radar. Only passive collection. It sounded good until we remembered. Passive collection is also visible if the object monitors changes in the electromagnetic background around the Earth. Because the Earth itself is noisy. We shine radio, communications, radar, and satellites into space. And this noise, to a smart visitor, is like a city at night. If he's truly studying us, he doesn't need us to send him a signal. He just needs to listen to how we live. And just then, a message came from one of the observatories that made everyone sit up straight. It changes phase when it passes over dense communication zones. It was put more simply than it should have been, but the meaning was profound. The object wasn't just responding to telescopes, but to our infrastructure. Immediately, flight maps, satellite paths, communication windows, aviation routes, and anything else that could coincide in time came up. And it did. Not perfectly, but enough to be terrifying. Every time the noisy belt appeared underneath, the glow parameters changed. It's as if it's not just flying by. It's as if it's scanning the Earth, stripes by stripes, picking out the areas where we're the loudest. Meanwhile, the PR team rolled out another calm text. It had it all: scientific interest, planned work, safe trajectory. And it seemed almost mocking, because inside they were already speaking in different terms. Not activity, but reaction. Not anomaly, but response. And then the object took a step that couldn't be attributed to statistics. It repeated the narrow indicator, but for only a few seconds, as if tapping on glass. Seconds are the language of machines. A comet usually breathes in minutes and hours. Seconds are no longer weather, they are action. And it was precisely in these seconds that two independent systems simultaneously noticed the same thing. A brief compression of the structure, as if the tail had momentarily become more collected. Focus doesn't just happen in a vacuum, it's either inherent or sustained. Where there was anxiety before, a new thought has now emerged, even more unpleasant. He's not just reacting, he's demonstrating what he can do. And if this is a demonstration, then the next question becomes too direct. Why demonstrate a feature if you don't want it to be noticed? Because a demonstration is always a message, even if it's wordless, even if it's short. At the end of the call, someone said something that summed it all up. He's not hiding. He's choosing when to be visible. And at that very moment, a new data packet arrived, not from a single telescope, but from a chain that never coincides in such an order by chance. The same indicator was there, but now it passed through the instruments like a wave, one after another, as if the object were checking them one by one. First south, then north, then orbit, as if he knew who was watching, and as if he answered each one individually. The wave passed through the instruments so neatly that a simple comparison clicked in my head. Not a flare, not a burst, a ping. As if someone were checking the communication line, only instead of servers there were telescopes. First south, then north, then orbit. Between them there was none of the chaos we're used to seeing in real nature. There was order, similar to how a system behaves when it knows the sequence of points in advance. The worst thing about these things is that they don't require faith, they require time. Give them a couple of hours, and statistics will cease to be an excuse. Give them a day, and anyone who continues to smile in public will become an excuse. A new term quickly emerged on NASA's internal channel. It wasn't spoken out loud during calls, but rather written visually in the chat. Consensus response. Someone tried to steer the conversation back to the familiar unstable coma, jets, and dust. But agreed upon sounded like a death sentence because it implied a second party. Not a source, but an interlocutor. Not a body, but a participant. And then something happened that finally shattered the calm. One of the deep space operators, a dry man who never adds emotion, wrote a single line. Repeatability by the minute, like a mark. Minute-by-minute repetition sounds innocent until you realize that the minute grid is our grid. Comets are not required to adjust to human time fractions. Nature loves smoothness. Machines love step. After this line, no one argued anymore about whether to bring in the heavy artillery. They brought in everything they could get their hands on without causing a public outcry. Hubble. Large ground-based mirrors. Radio waves. Spectra. And we've enabled things in parallel that aren't usually enabled together. Not because they can't, but because they don't do it without a reason. When you link independent tools into a single protocol, you create a single view. And it was precisely this single eye that the object apparently needed. For the first half hour, nothing happened, and it was almost worse than the flash. Because the brain waits for something to happen, to finally figure out whether to be afraid or not. And when the silence drags on, you start to fear the anticipation itself. Then came the polarimetry package. It was dry and boring in appearance, a collection of numbers that impress no one but those who understand the meaning. But the meaning was simple. The polarization change wasn't like dust. Dust produces characteristic signatures. Ice produces others. Here, the signatures changed as if the surface wasn't just different, but switchable. As if the object had reflectivity modes and was adjusting them to suit the conditions. Natural explanations immediately emerged. They said structures, orientation, rotation, inhomogeneities. It all sounded convincing, right up until the next point. The switchover occurred synchronously with the observation network becoming unified. Not when the solar flux increased, not when the geometry changed, not when yet another ordinary factor passed, but when we ourselves became a single instrument. A question immediately arose, one no one wanted to utter, but everyone was repeating in their heads. It reacts to the object or to the observer. And if it reacts to the observer, then we are participating in an experiment where we don't set the conditions. During the second hard call, someone suggested something that would have previously sounded like paranoia. Create a fake coordination. Deceive the target with a schedule to check whether they were following the fact of synchronization or just its trace. The idea was disgusting, but logical. If he's smart, he'll spot the fake. If he's not smart, he'll fall for the coincidences and repeat the reaction. Either option will give us the answer. That's when the blind protocol was born. Different teams were given different observation windows. Discussing exact minutes and shared channels was prohibited. Any shared schedule was broken into independent chunks. On the surface, it looked like routine scientific procedure. On the inside, it was like trying to avoid looking someone in the eye who might be looking back, yet still keeping an eye out of the corner of your eye. And it was during the blind protocol that the target did something that disconcerted even the calmest of minds. He reacted not to the matching windows, but to our decision to hide them. How it was noticed. Very simple and very scary. In the moments when the indicator used to appear, there was now silence. And when the windows accidentally overlapped, the indicator flared brighter, as if delighted by the discovery. It didn't seem like a natural process, but rather like a search. As if he was trying to bring us back together, no matter how much we had fallen apart. After that, words that weren't usually found in chats started popping up. Behavior. Task. Test. No one wrote mind because the word was too loud, and loudness was dangerous. But silence has also become dangerous. Because in such a situation, silence makes things even more personal. If you don't name it, it begins to seem closer than it actually is. The most disturbing discovery came from the radio links. There was no signal there that could be shown in a picture and the public told, "Here it is." There was something else, subtle changes in reflections. It was as if the object weren't emitting energy, but rather using what was already flying around it. It wasn't screaming. It was adjusting the echo, and that was even worse, because it doesn't require energy expenditure, but rather an understanding of the environment. One of the engineers put it as matter-of-factly as possible. He's using our lights to show us drawings. He added that the drawings weren't yet legible. But the very fact of drawings already broke the usual boundaries. At that moment, one of the leaders tried to restore discipline. Speculation was banned. Human language was banned. Only numbers were allowed. And that's when it became clear that banning wouldn't solve the problem. Because the numbers were already behaving like history. The numbers formed a sequence. And the sequence looked like a language. At that point, a decision was made that wasn't officially called a decision. They requested priority from orbital observation systems. It was expensive. It was politically sensitive. It couldn't be done without leaving a mark on the schedules. And traces in schedules love leaks. So, on the outside, they kept saying, "Nothing unusual." But inside, everyone understood that every such phrase was buying time. Not for science, but for controlling panic. Because public panic breaks protocol faster than any anomaly. And so we have come to that hour, which will later be re-watched frame by frame, if anyone is allowed to re-watch it at all. The hour began neither with a bang nor with a flash. It began with several independent instruments simultaneously communicating the same thing in different words. A shift, minor, almost imperceptible, but identical. Optical data indicated a slight tightening of the structure. Radio data indicated an uncharacteristic stability of the reflection. Spectra showed a change in profile, as if the tail's composition had changed over minutes rather than hours. This shouldn't happen synchronously. Even if a comet has a flare, the different bands usually diverge in time. Here they converged as if someone had pressed a button. And then, for the first time that night, a phrase rang out in the room that no one had ever dared to say out loud before. He chose the moment when we were watching together. This phrase required no proof because the evidence was already in the logs. Something else was needed. A decision on what to do next. Because what happened next might become not just an observation, but a dialogue. Dialogue has an unpleasant quality. It changes you even if you're silent. You still respond with your attention. And it was at this hour that the indicator took its next step. It ceased to be a point. It became a series. Short bursts, equal intervals, identical shape. Not alphabet, not text, not hello. But exactly what any communication protocol does at the beginning. It checks synchronization. It verifies that both sides hear the same thing. At one point, one of the operators quietly said, "We're going through a handshake now." No one asked him to explain what he meant, because everyone already understood. And here, for the first time, NASA became alarmed not by the object, but by the situation itself. Because if this really was a handshake, the next step would be an offer from the channel. And a channel is no longer astronomy. And the decision made at the end of the hour was brutal. Some systems were briefly shut down, not completely, not everywhere, but enough to disrupt overall synchronization. They didn't do it because they wanted to hide. They did it because they wanted to test. If the object repeats the sequence, it means it's speaking into the void. If the object changes its behavior, it means it's monitoring our connectivity. And when the synchronization broke, there was a 10-second silence that felt like an eternity. And then the indicator appeared again. Only now it was directed not at us, but as if between us. He walked along the torn web, trying to reassemble it into a coherent pattern. And that was the moment when, for the first time, everyone in the room shared a common feeling, without words or arguments. We are not simply observing an event. We are part of its conditions. No one in the room said, "He understood." That would have sounded like an admission. But from the way people stopped moving, it was clear. They were reacting not to space, but to us. The surveillance system fell apart for just a minute, and it felt like we'd turned off the lights in a room where someone was standing nearby and silent. The main fear came not from the data, but from the thought that we no longer control the next step. We can choose whether to watch or not, but the choice itself becomes a signal. That's when the first leak appeared. Nothing sensational, no aliens, just a screenshot of an internal chart showing major instruments suddenly shuffled around in 1 hour. The screenshot was sent to a private chat room for amateur astronomers, and from there it spread like water through a crack. It was seen by people who know how to compare schedules and understand the value of unexpected priorities. On NASA's official feed, everything remained smooth. No alarm, no emergency, just the usual phrases about a rare visitor and interest in its composition. And that's precisely what looks suspicious. Because when an agency is too calm, it either knows nothing or knows too much. Internally, however, a different line was taken. The communications team demanded something simple. No joint mentions, no talk of synchronicity, no numbers until verified. From a scientific perspective, this sounded like a mockery. Because the problem was precisely synchronicity. To prohibit its description was to prohibit the fact itself. Someone suggested a radical solution. Stop observing completely for an hour to remove the stimulus and see if the behavior persists. But this proposal died instantly. No one wanted to be the first to voluntarily turn off their eyes the moment the object was nearby. So we chose a compromise. Make the network uneven. Allow individual tools to work, but don't link them into a common protocol or synchronize windows. On the surface, this looked like the usual lack of coordination between different teams. On the inside, it was an attempt to hide not from the object, but from the shared gaze effect itself. And that's where the hour became a legend. People started calling it short and dry, without details. Simply that hour. As if a name could make it more real. At the same time, analysts began to dissect the event layer by layer. Not what they saw, but how they saw it. In what order? Which instruments were first? With what delay? And the delay was strange, not physical, but organizational. It seemed as if the object was reacting not to light and distance, but to the moment when we ourselves begin to form a coherent picture. It's as if he senses not a photon, but a correlation. Not a signal, but the fact that a signal is being compared. This sounds absurd until you see the second effect. When people began discussing that hour en masse after the leak, a new type of noise appeared in the data. No mysticism, just a subtle reshaping of the tale, as if the object had begun to work with what we do best: collective attention. At this point, another level of observation was activated. Not telescopes, but those who listen to space in a different sense. Deep space networks, receivers that pick up reflections and background noise. And then something strange emerged, causing the room to go silent. The reflection from the object seemed to become cleaner, precisely when we stopped merging the protocols. It was as if he wasn't trying to hide. It was as if he was waiting for us to gather again, and in the pause he left us a smooth line, almost an invitation. Someone said something that made me realize my fear had already given way to something else. He's patient. That word doesn't apply to rocks or ice. If you have a piece of ice, it reacts to the sun immediately. If you have a mechanism, it can wait until conditions are ideal. And the ideal conditions for it, it seems, are our synchronicity, our habit of combining independent sources into a single conclusion. Then the plan for a false shared view was born. Not just different windows, but a simulated global synchronization that doesn't actually occur. The idea was simple and vile. Publicly announce one observation window, but work on another internally. See what he reacts to, reality or expectation. But the plan ran into ethics and risk, because expectation is also a signal, and if he responds to expectation, then we're no longer in the lab, but in contact. The decision was made anyway, quietly, without signatures. The teams simply dispersed, each receiving their own portion of the design, just like in secret trials. At that very moment, that hour became even more dangerous because it began to exist outside of science. It attracted the attention of those who favor the words hush up and conceal. Inner fear gave way to outer fear. Now it was necessary not only to understand the object, but also to prevent the world from inventing its own ending to the story. And then something happened that no one had planned. A second, more accurate screenshot appeared. It wasn't an observation grid, but a correlation log. Lines showing that different countries are recording the same effect in the same minute. This isn't a schedule. It's evidence. The next morning, this log ended up in the hands of a journalist who knows how to ask questions rather than shout. This type is the most dangerous because it doesn't let you brush it off. NASA has activated smooth wall mode. Talking points, identical answers, conversations shifting to a general interest in interstellar objects. And it was on this day that the object took its third step. The quietest of all, and therefore the most eerie. No flash, just the disappearance of one subtle feature that we've come to consider his signature. It's as if he's removed the mark. This is not nature behaving this way, but someone who has realized that he is being watched for a specific reason and has temporarily removed him from sight. It was so subtle that no one noticed right away. But when they did, everyone felt bad. Because it meant being able to change style. You can explain the unusual tale. You can explain the strange spectrum. But you can't calmly explain the temporal camouflage. After that, the relationship between the scientific team and the PR team became almost hostile. The scientists wanted to speak honestly, while the PR team wanted to speak safely. Leaks always form in this crack, and these leaks were no longer caused by malice, but by powerlessness. Because people need someone to call something by its proper name. When a name is forbidden, the street makes one up. And then, against this backdrop of pressure, an event occurred that brought everyone back to the main point: the hour. The object repeated the series of bursts, but did so at a time when, according to the false common view, people were expecting synchronization. That is, he was responding not to actual coherence, but to the expectation of coherence. To our social timestamp. This wasn't about telescopes anymore. It was about us as a system that can focus on one thing and communicate that. Someone quietly said, "He reads the noise of civilization." No one objected, because there was nothing to object with. After this, it became clear that hiding within science would be impossible. Any step, even an organizational one, leaves a trace that could become a signal. This means that if the next step is even closer to Earth, we'll bring more than just telescopes. We'll bring our entire collective energy. And somewhere on the edge of all these discussions, a question was raised that had previously seemed like science fiction, but now sounded like a working point. If it responds to synchronization, what will happen at the moment of closest approach, when Hubble, terrestrial giants, and radio networks will all look at it at the same time? We're used to thinking of closest approach as just geometry. But that day, it began to sound like a possibility. An opportunity for him to show us what he considers necessary at the point where our concentration is maximum. And then someone proposed the final, most unpleasant test, to arrange for maximum convergence to occur at one time for society and at another for observation. Shift expectations. Break the collective metronome. See what the subject chooses, physics or attention. The plan was nearly impossible because the world lives on rumors faster than schedules. But they began preparing it anyway, because there was no choice anymore. Either you test carefully or you get tested without warning.